Chapter 1, The Truth After Cake. Calvin Dean had perfected the art of being exactly where he was expected to be and nowhere else. At his sister's birthday party, this meant standing near the kitchen island with a paper plate balanced in one hand, smiling politely when someone caught his eye, and never once blocking the walking path between the living room and the back patio. He had learned early that people preferred their spaces unobstructed, physically and otherwise, and Calvin had grown into the kind of man who made room without being asked. The cake was lemon with raspberry filling, his sister's favorite. There were candles, singing, applause, and the brief, bright moment where everyone looked at her like she was the center of the universe. Calvin clapped, grinned, and stepped back as soon as the plates came out. He loved his sister. He always had. That love had never required proximity. After dessert, the party fractured into smaller conversations the way family gatherings always did. Clusters of voices forming and reforming as people refilled drinks or drifted outside. Calvin found himself seated at the dining table with his father and one of his cousins, Mark, who worked in commercial real estate and spoke about it the way people spoke about weather, constantly and with the assumption that everyone else cared. "So," Mark said, swirling the ice in his glass, "must be nice. Surgeon dad, big house, no student loans, set for life." Calvin laughed reflexively, a short sound he didn't quite feel. "I don't know about that." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Come on, you've got the golden ticket. Everything handed to you." The words slid over the table casually, not unkindly. Calvin didn't pause to consider them. He answered the way he always did, with the truth, stripped of drama. "I paid for college myself," he said. "Worked 2 part-time jobs. Ate like a beggar. Ran on caffeine and optimism for 4 years. If that's the easy way, I'd hate to see the hard way." He smiled, expecting laughter. Mark chuckled. "Damn. Respect." Calvin's father did not laugh. The silence was subtle at first, the way a room changes temperature without announcing it. His father, still in his button-down from the hospital, stared at Calvin with a look Calvin couldn't immediately place. "What do you mean you paid for it yourself?" his father asked. Calvin shrugged. "Exactly what I said." His father set his glass down carefully. "What about the money I sent you every month?" Calvin blinked. Once, then again. "What money?" The words landed with a dull thud, like something dropped on carpet that should have shattered. "I transferred $2,000 a month," his father said slowly. "For rent, food, books. Your mother said she was handling it." Calvin felt something tilt inside him, not sharply, but thoroughly, like a shelf coming loose. He let out a small, confused laugh. "Mom told me you wanted me to stand on my own 2 feet, that it was your idea. I figured it was one of your lessons." His father's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. Calvin considered the question honestly. "Say anything about what?" The answer came easily because it was true. "The last thing I heard was that it was your decision. I wasn't going to beg you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the party continued. Someone laughing on the patio, plates clinking in the kitchen, but the space between Calvin and his father felt sealed off, airless. "I trusted her," his father said quietly. "She told me she was sending it." Calvin nodded. "I assumed you knew." His father stood abruptly, chair legs scraping against the floor. "Excuse me." Calvin watched him walk toward the kitchen, where his mother stood chatting with an aunt, her posture relaxed, her smile easy. The sight was surreal, like watching a scene you didn't have context for until the dialogue caught up. Calvin didn't follow. He didn't need to. His sister found him a few minutes later. She looked pale. "Cal," she said, sitting beside him. "I didn't know." He glanced at her, surprised. "Know what?" Her voice dropped. "About the money. I thought you were getting the same as me." Something in her expression, guilt, genuine and unguarded, made his chest tighten. "It's not your fault," he said immediately. She swallowed. "I keep thinking about you working yourself half to death and me complaining about my roommate while Mom was." She stopped, visibly nauseated. "What do you think of me?" The question startled him. "I think you're my sister," he said, "and that you didn't do anything wrong." She nodded but didn't look convinced. Across the room, voices rose and fell. His father's tone was controlled but sharp. His mother's was defensive, then brittle. Calvin didn't strain to hear. He didn't need the details. The story had already rewritten itself. On the drive back to his apartment later that night, Calvin kept his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. What he felt was quieter and more unsettling. A precise recalibration. He thought of the nights he'd fallen asleep at his desk, the meals skipped, the way he'd learned to make himself smaller even when he was exhausted. He thought of the shrug he'd perfected, the way he accepted difficulty without question. It hadn't been a lesson. It had been a choice, just not his. He wouldn't disown his mother. He wouldn't shout or demand explanations. But something essential had burned away, leaving a clean, irreversible boundary behind. Trust, once gone, didn't make a scene. It simply stopped showing up. By the time Calvin pulled into his parking spot, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He was done living like he belonged on the edge of the frame. Chapter 2, The Life He Built Quietly. Monday arrived the way it always did, without apology. Calvin Dean Badge tapped his way into the office at 8:42 a.m., coffee in one hand, messenger bag slung over his shoulder, posture already calibrated to the rhythm of the day. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and ambition. Screens along the wall cycled through company values in tasteful sans serif fonts. Calvin read none of them. He knew what was expected of him, and he delivered it with dependable consistency. His desk sat near the windows, not because he'd requested it, but because no one else had. Calvin liked it that way. Natural light, minimal traffic, fewer reasons for people to stop and talk unless they had a purpose. He logged in, scanned his inbox, and built his to-do list with the calm efficiency of someone who trusted systems more than people. By 9:03, he was already ahead of schedule. Work had always made sense to him. There were rules, metrics, outcomes. Effort translated mostly into results. It was the closest thing he had to fairness. Morning, Calvin. He looked up to see Mara Ellis leaning against the edge of his cubicle, holding a tablet like it was an extension of her arm. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun that suggested effort had been made and then intentionally abandoned. She wore a blazer over a graphic tee that read professionalish. Morning, he said, smiling before he could stop himself. Mara was a project manager, which meant she lived in a state of controlled chaos. She talked fast, thought faster, and somehow made everyone else believe the plan had been her idea all along. Calvin had admired her from a safe distance for nearly a year. I need your brain, she said, specifically the part that makes numbers behave. He swiveled his chair slightly. That depends. Are the numbers misbehaving aggressively or just being passive-aggressive? She grinned. Oh, full tantrum. He gestured to the empty chair beside his desk. Have a seat. As she launched into the issue, budget projections that didn't align with revised timelines. Calvin listened, fingers already moving, pulling up spreadsheets, cross-referencing data. This was where he shined. Quietly, without spectacle. You're not wrong, he said after a moment. But the variance isn't where you think it is. She leaned closer, brow furrowed. Show me. He walked her through it, explaining the discrepancy with patience and clarity. Mara nodded along, eyes bright, occasionally interrupting with sharp questions that made him adjust, refine, improve. When he finished, she sat back, exhaling. You just saved me from a very uncomfortable meeting. Happy to help. She studied him for a second longer than necessary. You okay? The question caught him off guard. Yeah, he said automatically. Then, after a beat, why? You're quieter than usual. He almost laughed. That would be impressive. She smiled but didn't look convinced. Lunch? His instinct was to deflect. He had leftovers. He had emails. He had reasons. But something in her expression, open, curious, unassuming, made him nod. Sure. They walked to a cafe down the street, the kind that tried very hard to look accidental. They ordered sandwiches and claimed a small table near the window. Calvin removed his jacket, folded it neatly over the chair back. Old habits. So, Mara said, unwrapping her sandwich, you survived the weekend? He hesitated. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it was newly fragile. Yeah, he said. Family thing. She raised an eyebrow. Good family thing or the kind that makes you question your life choices? He smiled faintly. The second one, but with cake. She laughed. Those are the worst. Cake makes it feel like a trap. He snorted before he could stop himself. The sound surprised them both. Sorry, he said. That was human, she supplied. It happens. They ate for a moment in companionable silence. Outside, traffic moved with indifferent purpose. My parents mean well, Calvin said eventually. Mostly. That mostly is doing a lot of work. He nodded. I found out something this weekend. About college. About money. Mara didn't interrupt. She just waited. I thought I was on my own because that was the plan, he continued. Turns out it wasn't. I just wasn't told. She grimaced. That's rough. It's fine, he said reflexively. She tilted her head. Is it? He considered that. The truth hovered uncomfortably close. I don't know yet, he admitted. I think I built my life around an assumption that turned out to be wrong. That'll mess with your foundation. He smiled at her phrasing. Yeah. She took a sip of her drink. For what it's worth, you built something solid. Even if the reason was flawed. The comment landed gently but firmly. Calvin felt it settle somewhere he hadn't known was empty. Thanks, he said. Back at the office, the afternoon passed quickly. Meetings, emails, small victories. Calvin noticed he spoke up more than usual in one discussion, offered an idea without waiting to be asked. No one objected. The world didn't end. At 5:30, he packed up and headed home. His apartment was modest but orderly, a reflection of his priorities. He reheated leftovers, sat at the small table by the window, and let the quiet wash over him. His phone buzzed. Mara, thanks again for today. Lunch, spreadsheets, existential crisis support. He smiled, thumbs hovering. Calvin, anytime. I'm excellent in a crisis. existential or otherwise. 3 dots appeared. Mara, good to know. I may test that theory. He set the phone down, heart beating just a little faster than usual. Later, as he lay in bed, Calvin thought about the life he'd built, the work he liked, the friends who knew him as reliable, calm, easy, the woman who'd seen a crack and hadn't looked away. He wasn't broken. He knew that now, but he was perhaps unfinished. And for the first time in a long while, that felt less like a flaw and more like an invitation. Chapter 3 Polite Distance. Calvin's mother called on Wednesday at 7:18 p.m. He knew the time because he stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds before answering, watching her name glow softly against the darkened living room. He had just finished rinsing a plate, the water still running, the apartment quiet in that end-of-day way that usually settled him. The call disrupted something he hadn't realized he was carefully maintaining. He turned off the faucet and answered. "Hi, Mom." Calvin. Her voice was composed, warm in the practiced way that had once reassured him. "I wanted to check in. I'm fine." The words came out evenly. He'd rehearsed nothing. He didn't need to. There was a pause, brief but telling. "Your father and I talked," she said. "Things got heated." "I imagine they did." She sighed. "I never meant for you to struggle like that." Calvin leaned against the counter, phone pressed to his ear. He pictured her in the kitchen back home, probably standing straight, probably already tidied up whatever mess the confrontation had left behind. "But you did," he said. "Yes, but I'm not calling to argue," he continued calmly, "or to hear explanations." Her breath caught just slightly. "I was trying to teach you responsibility. I learned it," he said, "very thoroughly." Another pause, longer this time. "You could have told me you were struggling," she said. He closed his eyes. "Not in anger, in understanding." "You told me Dad wanted me to handle it on my own," he replied. "I believed you." Silence stretched between them, taut but not explosive. "I don't know what you want from me now," she said finally. Calvin considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. "I don't want anything," he said. "I just need space. And honesty if we're going to talk." Her voice softened. "I am being honest." "No," he said gently. "You're being careful. There's a difference." He ended the call a few minutes later, polite to the end. He thanked her for calling. He wished her a good night. When the line went dead, he didn't feel relief so much as confirmation. At work the next day, Calvin was sharper than usual. Not tense, focused. He caught errors before they propagated. He asked questions in meetings instead of waiting for someone else to notice the gaps. When his name was mentioned, he didn't deflect credit. It wasn't a rebellion. It was an adjustment. Mara noticed. "You're terrifying today," she said, passing his desk with a stack of folders. In a very competent way. He smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should. People are listening to you." He glanced up. "They always have." She stopped, turning back toward him. "Yeah. But now you seem to know it." The comment lingered after she walked away. Later, during a mid-afternoon lull, his sister texted. "Sister, I'm still thinking about everything. Dad's furious. Mom's defensive. I feel sick." Calvin typed, erased, then typed again. "Calvin, you don't need to carry this. I'm okay." "Sister, you shouldn't have had to be." He stared at the words, throat tightening. He hadn't known he needed to hear that until it appeared on his screen. That evening, Mara found him in the break room, staring at the vending machine like it had personally offended him. "Indecision?" she asked. "Existential," he replied. "I don't trust anything that calls itself a meal and costs 90 cents. She laughed. "Fair." They ended up walking out together, empty-handed, the sun already low. The building's glass facade reflected them back. Two professionals in neutral colors, moving in sync without planning to. "You heading straight home?" she asked. "Probably." She hesitated, then said, "I'm grabbing dinner at that Thai place on Maple. You're welcome to join." No pressure. The old reflex kicked in immediately. Don't intrude, don't impose, don't assume. But something else followed close behind it, quieter but firmer. "I'd like that," he said. The restaurant was small and loud, the air thick with spice and conversation. They squeezed into a corner booth, knees nearly touching. Calvin noticed. He didn't move away. Over noodles and shared appetizers they talked. Not about work, not really. Mara told a story about her father's disastrous attempt to be supportive during her career pivot. Calvin listened, amused and attentive. "My family loves me," she said. "They just don't always know how to show it without turning it into a group project." He smiled. "That sounds familiar." She studied him. "You don't owe anyone silence, you know?" He considered that. "I'm not silent. I'm selective." "About what?" "About where I spend my energy." She nodded slowly. "That's healthy." They walked back to their cars afterward, the night cool and clear. At her door she paused. "I'm glad you came," she said. "So am I." There was a moment, unspoken, warm, charged, and then she smiled and got in her car. At home later, Calvin sat on his couch, lights low, phone resting beside him. His mother hadn't called again. His father had sent a brief message earlier, We'll talk when you're ready. Calvin appreciated the restraint. He wasn't angry. He was done pretending that politeness meant closeness. Distance, he was learning, could be chosen. And sometimes, choosing it was the most honest thing you could do. Chapter 4, The Almost Date. By Friday afternoon, Calvin had convinced himself that dinner with Mara had been exactly what it was. Two co-workers sharing a meal, nothing more, nothing less. Pleasant. Easy. Over. This belief lasted until 4:47 p.m., when she appeared at his desk with her bag already slung over her shoulder and an expression that suggested she'd made a decision and was prepared to stand by it. So, she said, I have tickets to a comedy show tonight. He blinked. You do. I do. Bought them weeks ago on a whim. My friend bailed. I remembered you laughed at my dad's story and thought, statistically speaking, you might enjoy stand-up. That's a solid metric, he said. She smiled. Want to come with me? The question hovered between them, deceptively simple. Calvin's first instinct was to say no. Not because he didn't want to go, he did, but because the invitation came with a faint hum of possibility, and possibility had a way of complicating things. He pictured himself misreading the situation, stepping out of bounds, making it awkward. He pictured being the wrong shape for the space offered. But then he remembered the recalibration, the shelf coming loose, the quiet promise he'd made to himself about not living at the edge of things anymore. Yes, he said. Her smile widened. Great. Doors open at 7. We can meet there, or I can meet you there, he said quickly. Too quickly. She paused, then nodded. Sure. I'll text you the address. As she walked away, Calvin exhaled slowly, heart thudding. He opened his calendar, out of habit more than necessity, and blocked off the evening like it was a meeting he needed to prepare for. At home, he stood in front of his closet longer than usual. He ruled out the suit jacket immediately. Too formal. The hoodie followed. Too casual. He settled on dark jeans and a button-down, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest intention. He checked the mirror, adjusted nothing, then adjusted everything. At the venue, the line curled around the block. The night was warm, the air buzzing with anticipation and laughter. Calvin arrived early, of course he did, and positioned himself near the entrance, scanning faces. Mara arrived 5 minutes later, breathless and smiling. Her hair down this time, loose waves catching the streetlight. She wore a simple dress and boots, effortless in a way Calvin recognized as practiced but not calculated. Hey, she said. Hey. They stood for a beat, the energy between them unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Inside, the room was dim and intimate. They found seats near the middle. The opener was loud and uneven, the headliner sharper, funnier. Calvin laughed more than he expected to. He felt present, engaged, not monitoring himself from a distance. At one point, Mara leaned over to whisper a comment about a joke, her voice close to his ear. He caught the scent of her perfume, something clean, citrus warm, and felt his focus wobble. After the show, they spilled out with the crowd, buzzing. That was great, she said. Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. They stood on the sidewalk, the moment stretching. Calvin sensed a decision point and panicked. Well, he said, stepping back slightly, I should probably head home. Early morning tomorrow. The words felt wrong as soon as they left his mouth. Mara's smile faltered, just a fraction. Oh, okay. Silence rushed in to fill the space he'd created. Good night, he added, too brisk. She nodded. Night, Calvin. He walked away, every step a reprimand. In his apartment later, he replayed the evening with forensic precision. The laughter, the proximity, the invitation he'd shut down without discussion. He told himself he'd done the right thing. Boundaries were healthy. Assumptions were dangerous. But the quiet felt heavier than usual. Saturday morning brought a text. Mara, hey, did I misread last night? Calvin stared at the screen, stomach dropping. He typed, deleted, typed again. Calvin, no. I mean, maybe? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be abrupt. Seconds ticked by. Mara, I just want to be on the same page. He appreciated that. The clarity, the directness. Calvin, I like spending time with you. I just tend to overcorrect. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Mara, overcorrect how? He considered dodging. He didn't. Calvin, I'm used to not assuming I'm wanted. The response took longer this time. Mara, that sounds exhausting. It was. He hadn't realized how much until she named it. Calvin, it can be. Pause. Then, Mara, coffee? No assumptions. Just conversation. Relief washed through him, swift and surprising. Calvin, I'd like that. They met at a small cafe near the park, sunlight streaming through the windows. Mara arrived with a notebook tucked under her arm. Calvin with his habitual punctuality. They sat across from each other, hands wrapped around mugs. I'm not great at ambiguity, she said. I'd rather ask than guess. I'm the opposite, he said. I assume and then retreat. She smiled wryly. We're a fun pair. He laughed. I didn't mean to make you feel dismissed. I know, she said. But I did. A little. I'm sorry. She nodded. Thank you for saying that. They talked then about patterns, about expectations, about the ways people learn to protect themselves. Calvin didn't give her his whole story, but he didn't minimize it either. He let himself be seen, at least partially. When they stood to leave, the moment returned. Lighter this time, less charged but more certain. "So," Mara said, "next time, no premature exits?" He smiled. "Deal." As they parted, Calvin felt something settle, not resolution, but alignment. The almost date had stumbled, but it hadn't ended. And for the first time, he didn't interpret that stumble as a sign to disappear. He went home with a quiet optimism, aware that growth rarely announced itself loudly. Sometimes it looked like staying. Sometimes it looked like answering a question honestly. And sometimes it looked like not walking away when the door was still open. Chapter 5. Rewriting the narrative. Calvin's father didn't call right away. He sent a message first, short, unadorned, unmistakably deliberate. "We should talk. When you're ready." Calvin read it twice, then set his phone face down on the table and finished making dinner. He didn't avoid the message. He simply refused to let it dictate the moment. That too was new. It was Sunday afternoon when he finally called back. The light through his apartment windows was soft, forgiving. He stood near the counter, phone in hand, heart steady. "Hey, Dad." "Calvin." His father's voice was tired, but clear. "Thank you for calling." They didn't rush into it. They talked about small things first. The weather, a recent case his father had been proud of, Calvin's work project that was nearing completion. It felt almost normal, which made the pivot sharper when it came. "I failed you," his father said quietly. Calvin closed his eyes, not in agreement or denial, but to listen fully. "I thought I was teaching you something," his father continued. "About independence, about resilience. I thought your mother and I were aligned. We weren't." "You didn't know," Calvin said. "I should have checked," his father replied. "I should have asked you directly how you were doing instead of assuming silence meant success." Calvin leaned back against the counter. "I didn't think I had the option to ask for help." "That's on me," his father said. "Somewhere along the way, I taught you that needing support was weakness. That wasn't my intention, but intention doesn't erase impact." The words settled between them, heavy and grounding. "I don't need apologies," Calvin said. "I just need clarity. Going forward." "You'll have it," his father said immediately. "And whatever else you need. No intermediaries." Calvin nodded, even though his father couldn't see it. "That means a lot." They sat with that for a moment, the quiet no longer strained. After they hung up, Calvin felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness, he wasn't there yet, but understanding. The difference mattered. That evening, he met Mara for a walk in the park. The air was crisp, the path busy with joggers and families. They fell into step easily. "You look lighter," she observed. "I talked to my dad." "Productive." "Yes," he said after a moment. "In a way I didn't expect." She smiled. "Those are the best kinds." They walked, talking about nothing and everything. At one point, Mara slowed, kicking a pebble off the path. "My mom and I didn't speak for a year once," she said casually. "Over something that felt small at the time and enormous later." "What brought you back together?" She shrugged. "Honesty, boundaries, therapy, not in that order." He laughed. "That tracks." She glanced at him. "You don't have to rush resolution, you know?" "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to fix it. Just understand it." She nodded approvingly. "Good." They reached the end of the path and turned back, the conversation shifting naturally to lighter things. Calvin noticed how comfortable he felt, how little he was editing himself. At work the next week, the shift became visible. In a project review, Calvin corrected an assumption early, confidently. When someone deferred to him, he didn't deflect. He didn't apologize for knowing his job. Mara watched from across the room, a small smile playing at her lips. After the meeting, she caught up with him near the elevators. "You were impressive in there." He shrugged, then stopped himself mid-gesture. "Thank you." She grinned. "See? Growth." That night, they cooked dinner together at his place. It wasn't a date they labeled, but it felt like one. They moved around each other easily, trading tasks, bumping elbows, laughing when the pasta boiled over. At one point, Mara leaned against the counter, watching him. "You're different than you think you are," she said. He glanced up. "How so?" "You assume your background," she said. "But you're not. You're just quiet in a way that makes people listen when you speak." He absorbed that, the idea both foreign and intriguing. Later, as they sat on the couch, knees touching, the moment arrived without fanfare. Calvin didn't retreat. He didn't overthink. He simply stayed. When she kissed him, it felt less like a leap and more like a step he'd been preparing for without knowing it. After she left, Calvin stood in his apartment, the quiet no longer oppressive. His phone buzzed with a message from his sister. "Thank you for not being angry at me." And another from his father. "Proud of you." Calvin smiled faintly. He wasn't rewriting his past. He was rewriting what it meant. And for the first time, the story felt like his. Chapter 6, The Awkward Apology Tour. Calvin's mother arrived with a casserole. It was a large one, heavy enough that she carried it with both hands, her elbows tucked in as if bracing against judgment. Calvin watched her from his apartment doorway, noting the careful way she smiled, the practiced warmth that had always made difficult conversations feel like inconveniences rather than necessities. "I didn't know what you'd want," she said, "so I made chicken tetrazzini. You always liked it." He stepped aside to let her in. "Thank you." She set the dish on the counter like an offering, smoothing the foil, aligning it with the edge. She looked around his apartment, clean, spare, intentional, and nodded as if cataloging evidence. "You've done well for yourself," she said. "I have." They stood there for a moment, the casserole steaming gently between them. Calvin didn't rush to fill the silence. He'd learned that quiet could be instructive. "I've been thinking a lot," she said finally. "About what happened." He nodded. "I imagine you have." Her mouth tightened, then softened. "I made mistakes." The words were careful, singular, contained. "Yes," Calvin said. She flinched almost imperceptibly. "I was afraid," she continued. "You were always so capable, so independent. I worried that if we helped too much, you'd never push yourself." Calvin leaned against the counter, arms loosely crossed. "I pushed myself. I know that now," she said quickly. "And I'm proud of you. I always was." He believed she believed that. He just didn't let it absolve anything. "You took something that wasn't yours to decide," he said calmly. "And you let me believe it was my fault when things were hard." Her eyes filled. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know," he said. "But intent doesn't change impact." She nodded, tears spilling over. "What can I do to make it right?" The question hung heavy, expectant. Calvin took a breath. He'd thought about this, about what he wanted and, more importantly, what he didn't. "I don't want money," he said. "I don't want explanations that turn into excuses. And I don't want grand gestures." She swallowed. "Then what?" "I want honesty," he said. "And I want you to accept that our relationship is going to be different." Her brow furrowed. "Different how?" "I won't confide in you the way I used to," he said. "I won't look to you for validation. We can be polite. We can be cordial. But trust isn't something I can give right now." The words were measured, but they landed with weight. She nodded slowly. "I don't like that." "I know," he said gently. "But liking it isn't required." She reached for his arm, then stopped herself. "I hope someday." "Maybe," he said. "But not today." She wiped her eyes, straightening her shoulders. "I'll respect that." He appreciated the effort, even if he didn't yet trust its durability. After she left, casserole untouched, Calvin sat on the couch and stared at the wall for a long moment. His phone buzzed. "Mara, how did it go?" He considered, then replied honestly. "Calvin, hard. Necessary." "Mara, want company?" The invitation was simple. No pressure. No assumptions. Calvin, yes. She arrived 20 minutes later with a loaf of bread and a bottle of wine. "I figured we could make the casserole feel less ceremonial." He laughed. "Good call." They ate at his small table, the mood lighter than he'd expected. He told her what he'd said, what he hadn't said, where he'd drawn the lines. "You didn't disappear," she observed. "No," he said. "I stayed. I just didn't bend." She smiled. "That's a skill." Later, curled on opposite ends of the couch, feet tangled, Mara turned to him. "You know, saying no doesn't make you unkind. I'm still adjusting to that idea. You can be compassionate and firm at the same time," she said. "It's not a contradiction." He leaned his head back, considering. "It feels like one." "That's because you were taught that harmony meant compliance." The accuracy startled him. "You're very perceptive." "I manage projects," she said dryly. "I can smell unhealthy dynamics from a mile away." They laughed, the sound easy. As the evening wound down, Mara stood to leave. At the door, she hesitated. "I'm proud of you," she said. "For what it's worth." He met her gaze, steady. "It's worth a lot." After she left, Calvin packed the casserole into the fridge. He labeled it with the date not because he needed to, but because he liked order. He liked knowing where things belonged. Later, in bed, he thought about the visit, not with regret but with clarity. He hadn't fixed anything. He hadn't smoothed it over. He'd simply told the truth and let it stand. For someone who'd spent his life stepping out of the way, it felt like a quiet revolution. Chapter 7, Choosing Visibility. The meeting had been scheduled for 45 minutes and was already running over. Calvin sat at the long conference table with his laptop open, fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, listening as the conversation circled the same 3 points for the fourth time. Voices overlapped. Ideas repeated themselves with different packaging. No one was wrong exactly. They were just stalled. In the past, Calvin would have waited it out. Let someone else synthesize. Let someone else take the risk of being the one who redirected the room. Today, he felt the familiar pull to recede, and then, just as clearly, he felt himself resist it. He cleared his throat. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the room. "If I can jump in for a second," he said. The talking stopped. Heads turned. Even the director at the end of the table looked up. Calvin's heart gave a single, heavy beat. then steadied. We're debating 3 solutions that all solve the same problem in different ways, he continued. But the constraint isn't design. It's timeline. If we anchor on the deadline instead of the preference, one option becomes obvious. He stood, moving toward the screen, and pulled up the model he'd been refining quietly for weeks. As he spoke, he felt something unfamiliar and grounding. Alignment. His thoughts moved cleanly into words. The room followed. When he finished, there was a pause. Then the director nodded. That's the clearest framing I've heard all morning. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Let's go with that, someone said. The meeting ended early. As people packed up, a few stopped by Calvin's seat, quick comments, appreciative nods. He accepted them without deflection, without apology. When Mara caught his eye from across the room, her expression was unmistakable. Pride, undisguised. She fell into step with him in the hallway. Look at you, she said, taking up space. He smiled, a little incredulous. Apparently the ceiling didn't collapse. Disappointing, she said. I had my camera ready. At lunch, they claimed a table by the window, sunlight catching in Mara's hair. She watched him over her salad. You know, she said, there was a moment in there where everyone just deferred to you. He shrugged, then stopped himself again. I noticed. How did it feel? He considered. Like I wasn't borrowing authority. Like it was already mine. Her smile was slow and satisfied. That tracks. The afternoon passed in a blur of momentum. Emails were answered quickly. Decisions stuck. When 5 o'clock came, Calvin felt energized instead of depleted. They walked out together, the sky streaked with late summer color. Come over, Mara asked casually. I have wine and a questionable amount of cheese. That's a compelling argument. Her apartment was brighter than his, softer around the edges. Plants lined the windowsill, books stacked in deliberate chaos. Calvin took it in, feeling welcomed rather than intrusive. They talked over dinner, sprawled on the couch afterward, legs tangled. At some point, Mara turned toward him, expression thoughtful. Can I ask you something without you disappearing? She said lightly. He met her gaze. I'll do my best. Why do you think you learned to stay small? The question wasn't accusatory, just curious. Calvin stared at the ceiling for a moment. I think it worked. Being unobtrusive meant fewer conflicts, less disappointment. And now it costs me things I want. She nodded. That's the part that usually prompts change. He smiled faintly. You're very good at this. At asking questions? She said. Or at liking you? He turned toward her fully. Both. The kiss that followed was unhurried. Sure. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. Later, as he walked home alone, Calvin replayed the day. Not with self-critique, but with recognition. He'd spoken up. He'd stayed. He'd let himself be seen. At home, his phone buzzed. Dad heard about the meeting. Your director mentioned it. Nicely done. Calvin stared at the message, then typed back. Calvin, thanks. Felt good. The response came quickly. Dad, you earned that. Calvin set the phone down, smiling. He moved through his apartment, the familiar quiet no longer synonymous with absence. He poured himself a glass of water, stood by the window, and looked out at the city lights. He thought about how visibility didn't require grand gestures. Sometimes it was just the refusal to step back when stepping forward felt deserved. He wasn't done learning. He wasn't suddenly fearless, but he was present. And for the first time, the life he built felt less like something he'd endured and more like something he was actively choosing. Chapter 8. The family photo. The invitation came in the form of a group text. Sister. Dinner at Mom and Dad's this Sunday. Just family. No cake, I promise. Calvin stared at the message longer than necessary. His first instinct was to decline politely. He had work. He had plans. He had the very reasonable excuse of emotional equilibrium. He didn't feel like destabilizing. Distance, after all, had been working. But something had shifted in him over the past few weeks. Not a hunger for confrontation. He still had no interest in that. But a growing certainty that avoidance and choice were not the same thing. He typed back. Calvin, I'll come. His sister responded with a single heart emoji. He imagined her relief, the way she always carried responsibility like it was a shared family heirloom. Sunday afternoon was warm and bright, the kind of day that made everything look more forgiving than it felt. Calvin parked in the familiar driveway and sat in his car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't bracing. He was preparing. Inside, the house looked unchanged. Same framed photos, same carefully arranged furniture. Evidence of continuity. His mother greeted him at the door, her smile careful but genuine. Hi, Calvin. Hi, Mom. She stepped aside to let him in. No hug. He appreciated that. His father emerged from the living room, expression softer than Calvin remembered it being in years. Good to see you, son. Good to see you too. They shook hands, an old habit that suddenly felt less awkward than it used to. His sister appeared next, pulling him into a quick, fierce hug before he could object. Thank you for coming. I said I would. Dinner was fine. Conversation stayed safely on neutral ground. work updates, a neighbor's new dog, a vacation his parents were planning. Calvin participated without disappearing. He didn't dominate. He didn't fade. After dessert, store-bought, no candles. His mother cleared plates while his father poured coffee. The familiar end of meal drift began, the subtle rearranging of people into smaller clusters. "Let's get a picture," his mother said suddenly. "We haven't had one in ages." The words landed with unexpected weight. Calvin felt the old reflex stir. Step aside, make room, be useful but not central. He saw the shape of the moment before it fully formed, the way it used to go. His sister looked at him, questioning. His father waited. Calvin didn't move. "I'll stand here," he said calmly, taking a place beside his sister instead of behind her. There was a flicker of surprise, then adjustment. His mother hesitated, then nodded. Of course. They stood together in front of the fireplace. The camera clicked. For once, Calvin didn't feel ornamental. Later, as coats were gathered and goodbyes said, his mother lingered by the door. "I meant what I said before," she told him quietly. "I'll respect your boundaries." He met her gaze. "Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. That felt like enough for now. Outside, his sister walked him to his car. "You were different today." He smiled faintly. "So were you." She squeezed his arm. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I." On the drive home, Calvin thought about how the past didn't rewrite itself just because you showed up differently, but the present could. When he got back to his apartment, his phone buzzed. "Mara, how'd it go?" He leaned against the counter, considering. "Calvin, I didn't disappear. A beat. Mara, proud of you." He smiled, warmth spreading easily this time. Later, lying in bed, Calvin replayed the day. Not with tension, but with clarity. He hadn't fixed his family. He hadn't reclaimed what was lost, but he'd claimed his place. Not out of spite, not out of obligation, out of choice. And that made all the difference. Chapter 9, in the frame, the photograph arrived in the family group chat on Tuesday morning. It wasn't a dramatic picture, no milestone event, no carefully coordinated outfits. Just 4 people standing in front of a fireplace, slightly off-center, mid-smile. Calvin noticed immediately what was different. He hadn't been cropped in later. He studied it for a moment longer than necessary, then locked his phone and went back to work. The week unfolded with the quiet confidence of routine. Projects moved forward. Meetings stayed efficient. Calvin found himself speaking without rehearsing, contributing without measuring the space first. The change wasn't loud enough for anyone to comment on directly, but it showed in the way people turned toward him when decisions needed to be made. On Thursday, Mara stopped by his desk near the end of the day. "Stay late with me?" she asked. "Not for work. I just don't feel like ending the day yet." He glanced at the clock. "I can do that." They ordered takeout and ate at her apartment. Shoes kicked off, music low. The city hummed outside the windows, distant and steady. "You know," Mara said, leaning back against the counter. "When I met you, I thought you were the most competent person in the room who had no idea." He smiled. "That tracks. I don't think that anymore." "What do you think now?" She considered. "I think you know. You just don't need to prove it." The comment settled easily, like it belonged there. Later, they sat on the couch, legs intertwined, watching something neither of them was fully paying attention to. Calvin felt the familiar urge to catalog the moment, to note how rare it was, how easily it could slip away. Instead, he stayed in it. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," he said quietly. Mara muted the TV. "Dangerous topic." He smiled faintly. "I don't think it's a requirement. Not the way people talk about it." "I agree," she said. "Forgiveness isn't a moral deadline. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive my mom," he continued. "But I also don't want that to define me." She nodded. "It doesn't have to. Boundaries can exist without bitterness." He exhaled, the thought easing something tight in his chest. "I used to think being good meant being agreeable. And now I think being good means being honest. Even when it's inconvenient." She smiled at him, warm and unguarded. "That's my favorite version of you so far." The next Saturday, Calvin invited his sister for coffee. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a message, a time, a place. She arrived early, nervous energy radiating off her. "You didn't have to do this," she said, sitting down. "I wanted to." They talked easily, about work, about the book she was reading, about a vacation she was planning. Eventually, she grew quiet. "I still feel guilty," she admitted. "About everything." He looked at her steadily. "You don't need to carry that. I don't resent you." "I know," she said. "But I hate that you thought you were alone." "So did I," he said. "For a long time." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You're not. Not anymore." He smiled. "I know." As weeks passed, the sharp edges of the revelation softened. Not through denial, but through integration. Calvin didn't forget what had happened. He simply stopped letting it narrate every choice. His relationship with his father grew steadier, defined by direct conversations and mutual respect. His mother maintained distance with visible effort. It wasn't perfect. It was honest. With Mara, things deepened without urgency. They learned each other's rhythms, their respective tells. Calvin noticed how easily laughter came now, how natural it felt to reach for her hand in public without checking the room first. One evening, months later, they attended another comedy show. This time, when it ended, Calvin didn't look for an exit. They walked out into the night together, shoulders brushing. "Want to grab dessert?" he asked. Mara smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." As they waited in line at a late-night bakery, Calvin caught their reflection in the glass. Two people standing close, unguarded, entirely present. He thought about the boy he'd been, the man he'd become by necessity, the one he was choosing to be now. Visibility, he'd learned, wasn't about demanding attention. It was about allowing yourself to be included. Later, back at his apartment, Calvin hung a new photo on the wall. Not a family portrait, not a carefully curated moment, just a candid shot Mara had taken of him at the park one afternoon, laughing at something off camera, unposed and unmistakably there. He stepped back and looked at it. For most of his life, Calvin Dean had existed as an outline, useful, reliable, easy to overlook. He hadn't been invisible. He'd simply made himself unobtrusive. Now, he understood the difference. He didn't need to rewrite his past to claim his present. He didn't need to forgive on a schedule or prove his worth through endurance. He had built a life quietly, yes, but now he was living it out loud enough to be heard by the people who mattered. And when he stood still long enough to notice, he realized something else, too. He wasn't standing on the edge of the frame anymore. He was exactly where he belonged.